Do you remember last year's Halloween special where I reviewed 3 old creepypastas people have a lot of nostalgia for and discussed in detail why they really didn't hold up? Well, no sequel to that video this Halloween, but we are nearing the end of Godzilla month. So, for our next entry, let's take a look at one of the most popular and highly regarded creepypastas of all time. A sprawling 8-chapter epic which demands its own dedicated video. You can run, but you know it's still the best. NES Godzilla. It could be argued that 2011 was the peak of creepypasta mania. Interest in the online urban legends was at a high, and authors were attempting to push the boundaries of what could be done with the format. Stories were getting longer, more in-depth, and in some cases, astonishingly, better. NES Godzilla arrived at the height of this, being serialized on the Bogleach internet forum between April and December of 2011, during something of a dry spell for the franchise as a whole. No new movie had been released in 7 years, and even alternative mediums like video games had also dried up around this time. Meaning outside of the comics, this was the first major Godzilla story since Final Wars. Think about that. It's gone on to have a solid reputation in both the Godzilla and creepypasta communities, with even those who aren't the biggest fans still acknowledging it as, at the very least, alright, and a step above some of the other stories achieving massive popularity at the time, a stance that I agree with. You'll never catch me saying the story is perfect, but I do think it holds up reasonably well thanks to its effective atmosphere, engaging story, and surprisingly solid prose. But with that said, it is still a creepypasta. There's going to be some goofiness, stuff that doesn't make sense, things trying to be scary that are mostly just awkward, etc. All of which I will get into, along with the stuff that works and examining why it does. So, over a decade later, let's boot up this relic once again and power through NES Godzilla. The story here is nothing special, at least as far as the setup goes. The crux of this pasta is the same as nearly every other popular gaming creepypasta ever written. Some dude, a guy named Zachary in this case, locates a haunted copy of a game from his childhood, Godzilla Monster of Monsters, and begins playing it and documenting what he sees, soon discovering that this is no ordinary cartridge. The changes are initially subtle and unassuming. Glitch here, boss monster that wasn't in the original game there, but quickly, well, not that quickly in this story's case, turn more sinister, with disturbing imagery, blurring the lines between reality and fantasy, and an ultimate villain revealing itself. Zack is sure to find himself in a world of trouble. Like I said, pretty standard from the setup, but it's the way these events are portrayed that keep them from feeling monotonous. All gaming pastas that follow this setup, when it comes down to it, are just people playing a game. And if the story is poorly written and unengaging, that's all it's gonna feel like. Sonic.exe is just a guy playing a game, and it reads like it's just a guy playing a game. Here, Zack is just playing a game, but through effective storytelling and immersive visuals, it never feels that way. On the topic of those visuals, I think the best way to go about reviewing the story is simply going through all the things it gets right, and then circling around and highlighting what it gets wrong. But let's begin with the good. Case in point, easily this creepypasta's defining feature are the hundreds of screenshots that accompany it, which are used to depict the nightmarish events within the game, and are explained in-universe as Zack taking the pictures during the playthrough. Admittedly, this gets a little goofy towards the end, as Zack apparently has time to screenshot all this, even as the game is getting horrendously difficult, but whatever, it's still very impressive sprite art and contributes to one of the overarching pros of the story: mood. I'm gonna be honest, most horror media, especially creepypastas, don't really scare me. Very specific things legitimately freak me out, and those usually aren't in these stories, which is why I don't really read or listen to them with the primary intention of being scared. Still, if it can create an intoxicating atmosphere of dread and mystery, I can admire the technique of it even if I'm not actually frightened. That's along the lines of how I feel here. I'm not going to act like I was terrified during the story, but I could feel the atmosphere. There's a great sense of discovery throughout. The initial dangers are small, but only increase in bizarreness, frequency, and pertinence to the main character's past the deeper he gets. We go from just different levels and monsters that weren't originally in the game, to the malformed not variations of the original bosses, to the hellish final level populated by photorealistic gore demons. Kinda reminds me of Doom, to be honest. What makes this work is that while the descriptions and imagery can get intense, it never feels like it's just edge for edginess sake, like, again, Sonic.exe. Maybe it helps that Godzilla as a series isn't necessarily as squeaky clean as something like Sonic, so a fan work putting forward this imagery isn't as out of left field. Another reason the scary stuff works? It's used sparingly. While it is a horror story, it's not myopic in its tone. There's action, suspense, even light comedy. Again, all through the lens of some guy sitting on his ass playing a video game. That makes the horror element stick out more when something really, well, horrific happens. Of course, you can't talk about NES Godzilla without mentioning its primary antagonist, Red. Actually, he isn't known as Red throughout most of the story. Initially, Zack just refers to him as the Red Face. After that, he's named either the Spider Beast, the Red Monster, or the Hell Beast. I like that the creator went the extra mile and designed a wholly original monster for this story, rather than doing something generic like making it another dark, evil version of the main character. It's a somewhat cluttered, but still really cool design. Dare I say, one that rivals some of the official monsters' appearances. We even get several different forms of it throughout for variety, even if some of them can look a little goofy. Come to think of it, there's a lot of original creations in this game, like the Knot monsters, the Chimera, and even an original playable kaiju named Solomon. All of them you can tell the author put a lot of effort into, and wanted these designs and abilities to stick with you. On top of that, if you couldn't tell, this story is chock full of fan service, but in the best way. The additional monsters, both playable and non-playable, from the films, and how the unique moves are incorporated shows a lot of thought on Cosby Daft's part. It's clear they're a fan and wanted to cater to fellow G fans first and foremost, and their efforts are appreciated. One more thing before we move on that's worth pointing out, seeing as this is a written story, is that the writing is remarkably competent. As far as creepypastas go, competency is something to celebrate. After all, it might not always be great, but at least the tense is consistent. So we know that this pasta gets a lot right. The author has legitimate skill to back up their enthusiasm. However, while I do really like this story and will gladly point out its highlights, its shortcomings are hard to ignore. I don't think any of them destroy it, but they are worth pointing out. Given that this is a creepypasta, some of these are just tropes of the genre that you're either going to be fine with or you're not. For instance, the countless plot threads that are never fully explained, like just what the hell Red is, or what the history between him and Solomon was, or what the face sections were all about. Oh my god, that's right, the face sections. This little fucker, along with Red and Solomon, is the most recognizable original character from this pasta, but the results are less successful than the other two. Face only appears in these segments in which he asks Zachary a series of questions ranging from dark to random to outright nonsense. This could have been a good way to get inside Zack's head and learn a little more about him, since he's mostly just a narrator the whole time. But in practice, they serve as a little more than a red herring. Not a very good one. Like, you think it's going somewhere, and then it doesn't. Really got us with that one. Speaking of not knowing much about Zachary though, that's another thing you might also mind, or you won't. As it's told in first person, people are used to stories where the POV character doesn't have much to them and is just an avatar for the reader. Like Red, we don't even find out his name until towards the end. And outside of some more lurid details I'll talk about later, we know nothing else about him. What does he look like? How did he act before all this? No. You know what? Forget all that. I know exactly what this guy was like before playing this game.
His grandma's house is where he stays. It's been 10 years since he's been laid. At 35, his world's a wreck, collecting unemployment checks. Zack, he's a psychomaniac.
What? You got a better headcanon? But alright, that's small potatoes to what the two big issues with this story are. One, it's too long. Once again, I respect the author for dedicating this much time and trying to elevate the medium to new heights by attempting to tackle something most wouldn't. An epic creepypasta. That doesn't mean it couldn't have used some editing. Every time I read this story, the exact same thing happens. It starts off good, then drags a little bit in the middle, and picks up some steam towards the end. Weirdly, that means the best chapters for me are the first 4. That's where the buildup is. That's where most of the suspense is. I'll always remember how perfectly set up the first appearance of Red is, and how well handled the initial allusions to the supernatural elements are. It's intoxicating and a real page-turner. In a figurative sense, that is, because it wasn't printed on paper. Much like Zack's own descent, our morbid curiosity gets the better of us as we simply have to know what's next. But then we reach the big fucking beast that is Chapter 5, Entropy, which also holds the dubious honor of being where the seeds of true fuckness that await us towards the end are planted. Admittedly, Entropy is so dense and has so much going on in it that some of it is really cool, but the overall experience is just too overindulgent and definitely needed one or two more revisions to be truly worth it. Then there's Exodus, which is probably my favorite of the latter chapters. It's fast-paced and entertaining, with a lot of cool appearances, and acts as a nice breather level for the two mammoth chapters it's sandwiched between. Plus, the ending is probably my favorite cliffhanger of the entire story. But then the tedium starts right back up again with Zenith, which, while not as laborious as Entropy, still would have benefited from some trimming. This chapter's Hadean imagery is its saving grace. It looks wonderfully hideous, which is why it really sucks that by the time you've gotten here, you're kind of burnt out. File this under sub-problems with the story. It tends to run out of steam after a while. I mean, with such great anticipation building, I guess it'd be hard to pay it off fully, but whatever the best way to do it is, this author couldn't figure it out in time, as, oh yes, we've come to it. Let's talk about the ending. First though, some table setting. Earlier, in Chapter 5, an encounter with a monster known as the Moon Beast prompts Zack's recollection of his history with his childhood girlfriend named Melissa, who was more than a little mentally disturbed, but Zack loved her anyway, because he's a good guy like that. Anyway, all this came to a head one night when Melissa charged into oncoming traffic and got run over by a semi-truck. Yikes. All of this is relevant, but let's fast forward to the end to find out why. Because in the final chapter, after doing nothing but running from it the rest of the game, Zack has to fight Red, who lays it out real clearly. Only one will survive. If Zack can't kill Red, then Red will kill Zack. Oh, and Red's attacks against the monsters can now physically affect Zack. So if Red, say, claws Godzilla, Zack feels it. Okay, that's a decent setup for the ending. What better way to finish a video game than with a final boss, right? We've been setting up Red since the beginning, so now it's time to see what he's capable of, and Zack's elite gamer skills must be put to the test if he's to survive. The ensuing battle also leads to probably my favorite individual screenshot of the entire story. It just looks so intense and violent, you really feel the heat emanating from it. The rest of the fight isn't too bad either, and another example of this author knowing their way around this series, Mothra's dead. A little cliche, but it's nice to see some actual consequences to this battle. However, the first real problem with the ending shows itself here, as Red, who so far has been mostly mute aside from the occasional howl, now suddenly never shuts up, and his dialogue is just the blandest, most stock villain phrases ever. Come on, this was the best you could do? Okay, I'll accept it, but if Red says to Zachary, "We're not so different, you and I'm out of here." Doesn't seem all that likely since Red's dead now. Oh fuck, the fake out. Classic. Jesus Christ, Red is huge. He was barely bigger than Godzilla when we first saw him. Now he's like Godzilla Earth-sized. So Red makes short work of Zachary's monsters. Okay. Including Godzilla. Okay. And is about to kill Zack when he decides to share his little secret. What the hell did that happen? Red's been confined to a video game this whole time. Unless he can manifest elsewhere and just decides to stay in the game? If so, why? The hell kind of demon of doom is this? Willingly stays locked in a 25-year-old NES cartridge. And if he can't leave the game, then how did he kill Melissa? It's not like her death was ambiguous. No, it was quite clearly laid out. She got run over by a truck. So either this was during Red's stint as a truck driver, or I don't know, maybe Melissa herself played the game years ago when Red infiltrated her mind and forced her to kill herself? In which case, holy shit, that is some stars aligning coincidence right there that Zack just happened to buy the exact same copy that his dead girlfriend played, what, 20 years prior? Ugh. So Red is about to finish Zack off when he's suddenly stopped by Melissa. Now, to the story's credit, they do set this up earlier with this blue statue thing that appears in Exodus, which sacrifices itself by intervening when Red is about to eat Godzilla. This later ends up being revealed as Melissa's form within the game. So fair play for that, but guess how Zack manages to defeat Red?
I can't fight Red, but there is one who can. I will release him from Red's grasp.
Of course! Acacius. The random monster that was just introduced in the last chapter on the last board that Zack's never played as, so we know nothing about, and who serves no other purpose in the narrative than to defeat the bad guy. And guess what? He defeats the bad guy! Way to keep me on my toes. After the final blow has been struck, Zack is still left with the reality that all his monsters are dead, or Melissa just revives all of them. Sure. So, this one chapter not only has a literal deus ex machina in the form of Acacius, but also a consequence-free ending in which nobody really dies. While we're at it, why couldn't Godzilla have been the one to kill Red? Granted, he's the last of Zack's monsters to die, but I still think he should have put up a little more of a fight. Might seem cliche, but it'd sure be a lot more satisfying than stupid Acacius coming out of nowhere. So, after all that, I can see why people think so lowly of this ending. After 8 chapters of build-up, was this really the best payoff we could have gotten? No. I would argue, however, that it would have been very difficult for the author to come up with anything that fully delivered. You know we were never going to find out what Red was, or anything about how the game worked. And even if we did, it'd be worse because there'd be a 90% chance that it'd be wholly unsatisfying. Still, while I do think this ending is the weakest part of the game, I was playing up my anger a little bit earlier, as there are some things I like about it. As lazily constructed as it is, the fact that this creepypasta actually attempts a happy ending, something so rarely seen, is a nice change of pace, even if it wasn't executed great. Just seeing Red be defeated is satisfying, as he's so formidable you simply have to see how he'll be conquered. And while the last full chapter is crap, the epilogue is actually very clever. You know how a lot of gaming creepypastas begin with the narrator obtaining the game through someone selling it or some other kind of mysterious vendor? Well, this story ends with Zack selling the cartridge on eBay, which is kind of a dick move on his part and way to pass the buck, guy. But also an interesting reversal of ending this story, presumably where another one can begin. Foreshadowing. That decision, I think, makes up for the lackluster finale and ends the story on a good note. Of course, every story is more than just what's contained in the words. There's also the impact it leaves and how people think of it after its release, especially over 10 years later. I think what stands out to me most about this narrative is the 2 similarly sized followings it has in 2 completely different fandoms. Creepypasta fans generally regard this as a high point for the genre, citing its memorably grisly storytelling and eye-catching sprite art as worth singling out for praise. Meanwhile, Godzilla fans love it simply for the vast amount of references and obvious respect and adoration CosbyDAF has for the Godzilla franchise. This can also promote crossover between the 2 fan bases, as creepypasta heads may read it and go, you know, these monsters seem pretty cool, I'm gonna check out some of the movies to see where they came from. While G fans can say, huh, maybe I was sleeping on these, this is actually kinda creepy. And both communities are strengthened. Now, I'm sure you've been waiting for me to mention it the whole video, but there is a sequel out called Godzilla Replay. Unfortunately, it has yet to be finished, and CosbyDAF's progress on it has been glacial. I'd love to have more to say about it, but seeing as how it's incomplete, I'll have to wait until it's concluded to pass judgment, however long that may be. Plus, even if it never gets finished, I'd still be fine just leaving the original as is, since it's not like the story ever felt incomplete or demanded a follow-up. Yeah, the ending is pretty open, but it's not a cliffhanger or anything. You could stop here and you'd be fine, leaving the ultimate fate of the cartridge a mystery, and just be thankful Zack's somehow alive. Of course, if you do want to experience this story but aren't interested in putting in the effort to actually read the whole thing, the internet has you covered. There are several readings of this all over YouTube, all of which are pretty good from what I've seen. Still, my absolute favorite is, no surprise, the Goji 73 reading. Melodramatic as it may be at times, it matches the tone well. There's more than one voice actor, spectacular music choices, and parts that fit in so well you have to wonder how this story wasn't originally meant to be read aloud in this way. It is my favorite reading of any creepypasta, and you just knew as soon as you clicked on this that I was going to be using the music from it all throughout the video. So what is there really even left to say about NES Godzilla? In spite of its many faults, it's still an incredibly popular and well-regarded story with a loyal fanbase that, as I said, pulls off the feat of occupying two different fandoms at the same time. As for what I think about it overall, well, that's tough. I will say, upon closer examination, the cracks in this narrative do present themselves more clearly. Honestly, you could tear this apart like tinfoil if you so desired. However, if you're not interested in being a sarcastic asshole and are game to just kinda let the experience wash over you, as I've done so many times before, you can find a lot to enjoy. When viewed from that angle, I still really like it. Yes, there's problems, but even when it comes to the most egregious flaws, like the entire ending, I've read and listened to it so many times that it just sorta comes and goes with the territory and doesn't spoil my overall feelings. I would understand if someone else was really let down by it though. So overall, I'm sorry, I couldn't resist.